Long before people spoke his name with wonder, before kings sought his skill and poets remembered his inventions, there was only a boy in Athens whose hands seemed to understand the world in a way that no one could explain. Athens was still becoming itself then. The city had not yet reached the greatness that later generations would celebrate, yet even in those early years it carried a particular spirit. It was a place where people believed that wisdom could shape stone as surely as strength could lift it, where careful thought was valued alongside courage, and where every craft carried a quiet dignity. The people looked to Athena, goddess of wisdom and skilled hands, believing that every well-cut beam, every carefully balanced wall, every graceful carving honored her as surely as any prayer. Into that city Daedalus was born. From the beginning, there was something unusual in the way he touched the world. Other children picked up stones because they were there. Daedalus picked them up because he wished to know how they had been shaped by wind and rain. Others broke branches simply to hear them snap. He turned them over slowly, tracing the grain with his fingers, wondering why one bent while another broke, why one felt light and another carried surprising weight. His hands were curious before they were strong. His eyes were patient before they were clever. When he watched a craftsman splitting timber, he did not see only the finished board. He watched the direction of the blade, the changing color beneath fresh cuts, the way the wood resisted for a moment before yielding. Every action became a question, and every question quietly searched for its answer. Those who knew him often noticed long moments of silence. They mistook them for daydreaming. But Daedalus was rarely dreaming. He was observing. He watched sunlight move across polished bronze and wondered why some surfaces welcomed light while others swallowed it. He watched birds settle upon rooftops and noticed how each feather rested against the next. He watched fishermen repairing nets and wondered whether every knot served only one purpose or many. The world spoke constantly. Most people heard noise. Daedalus heard instruction. As he grew older, he entered the workshop of a respected craftsman, as nearly every gifted young artisan did. The apprenticeship was expected to shape him, to teach him the traditions passed from one generation to another. Instead, something quieter happened. The traditions gave him names for things he had already begun to understand. His teacher showed him how to hold a chisel. Daedalus adjusted his grip almost without thinking, until it rested more naturally in his hand. His teacher demonstrated how to judge the straightness of a board. Daedalus noticed tiny imperfections before anyone pointed them out. There was never arrogance in him, only attention. He asked questions not because he doubted those teaching him, but because he wished to understand why every tool had taken its present form. Why did the handle curve this way? Why was one hammer heavier than another? Could a blade become sharper without becoming weaker? These questions did not always have answers, so Daedalus began searching for them himself. The workshop slowly became the place where he felt most completely at home. Outside, Athens moved with the ordinary rhythm of city life. Merchants argued over prices. Children chased one another through narrow streets. Potters fired clay. Shepherds returned from the hills, and fishermen unloaded their catches beneath the warm Mediterranean sun. Inside the workshop, time seemed to follow another measure. Morning began with the scent of fresh-cut cedar and olive wood. Bronze waited patiently beside charcoal fires. Stone rested in neat stacks, each block holding shapes invisible to everyone except the craftsman who would one day reveal them. Daedalus loved every part of it. He loved sweeping the floor because even the curls of shaved wood seemed beautiful. He loved sharpening blades because each careful stroke returned purpose to the metal. He loved arranging tools in their proper places, where every instrument waited exactly where the hand expected to find it. To him, a workshop was not simply a room. It was a conversation between the maker and every material the earth had offered. Wood asked for patience, stone asked for certainty, metal asked for courage, because it demanded fire before it would become what it was meant to be. The more Daedalus worked, the more the city began to notice. People spoke quietly of objects unlike any they had seen before. A carved figure whose posture seemed ready to move. A wooden hinge that turned more smoothly than anyone believed possible. A balance that measured weight with astonishing precision. Nothing he made called attention to itself through decoration alone. Everything possessed a feeling of quiet rightness, as though the object had always wanted to exist exactly as he had made it. Visitors sometimes entered his workshop simply to watch him work. They expected dramatic movements. Instead, they found calm. Daedalus rarely hurried. Before making the first cut, he often stood silently before the material for several moments. He would run his fingertips gently across the grain of the wood or the cool face of a stone, allowing the material to introduce itself. Only then would he begin. Watching him was strangely peaceful. Each movement followed naturally from the one before it. The sound of a plane gliding across timber. The steady rhythm of hammer against chisel, the soft whisper of sand smoothing rough edges. Nothing was wasted, nothing felt forced. Athens admired cleverness, but what impressed people most about Daedalus was something deeper than cleverness. He seemed incapable of making carelessly. Even the smallest object deserved his full attention. A simple stool received the same careful balance as a ceremonial chair. A carpenter's square was shaped with the same devotion another craftsman might reserve for a sacred statue. To Daedalus, usefulness possessed its own kind of beauty. He began imagining tools that did not yet exist. Sometimes he would wake before dawn because an idea refused to leave him. He would light a small lamp while the city still slept, and quietly test different pieces of wood or bronze, listening as materials revealed what they could become. Failure never discouraged him. A broken piece of timber was not a mistake. It was instruction. A cracked casting was not defeat. It was another sentence in a conversation that had not yet finished. Day after day, season after season, his workshop filled with new ideas. The walls carried carefully arranged tools. Shelves held models, unfinished experiments, and curious mechanisms whose purposes only he fully understood. Visitors often felt there was something alive about the room itself, not because the objects moved, but because every unfinished piece seemed patiently waiting for the next touch of the maker's hand. As evening settled over Athens, and the last golden light slipped through the workshop doorway, Daedalus remained standing before a fresh length of timber, resting one hand lightly upon its surface, already beginning to sense that hidden somewhere inside the silent grain was another invention waiting patiently to be found. He rested one hand lightly upon the silent grain, already beginning to sense that hidden somewhere inside the timber was another invention waiting patiently to be found. The years passed through the workshop as gently as dust settling upon a polished bench. Athens continued to grow around Daedalus, and with each season his reputation reached farther through the city. People came seeking doors that swung more smoothly, temples whose beams would endure longer, tools that made difficult work easier. Yet those who entered his workshop soon discovered that the greatest craftsman in the city did not speak first about finished objects. He spoke about beginnings. He would hold a piece of wood toward the light and explain how every tree had lived a different life before becoming timber. He would turn a block of marble slowly in his hands, saying that the stone already possessed its own nature, and that a craftsman succeeded only by listening carefully enough to discover what the material wished to become. Many admired his skill. Few understood the patience from which that skill was born. One spring morning, another beginning arrived. His sister came to the workshop with her young son. The boy's name was Perdix. He was still young enough that his hands seemed almost too small to hold the larger tools hanging neatly along the walls. His eyes wandered everywhere at once, moving from chisels to saws, from wooden patterns to unfinished carvings, with a curiosity that reminded Daedalus of his own childhood. The request was simple. Would Daedalus teach him? The master craftsman looked at the boy for a long moment before answering. He did not search for talent in the firmness of the hands or the strength of the arms. Those things would come with time. Instead, he watched where the boy's attention settled. Perdix was not looking at the finished works displayed upon the shelves. He was studying the workbench. He noticed the small curls of cedar lying beside a plane. He picked up an unfinished peg and quietly turned it between his fingers, trying to understand why one end had been shaped differently from the other. Daedalus smiled almost without realizing it. He recognized the look. It was the look of someone asking silent questions. The workshop gained another pair of hands. At first, the lessons were simple. How to sweep carefully enough that useful scraps were not thrown away. How to sharpen a blade until it reflected light without removing more metal than necessary. How to hold a chisel firmly without forcing it. Daedalus taught as patiently as he worked. He never hurried Perdix. When the boy made mistakes, Daedalus rarely corrected him immediately. Instead, he would ask gentle questions. What do you notice? Why do you think the wood split there? What did the grain try to tell you? Often Perdix answered correctly before the explanation was needed. The workshop grew quieter in the most comforting way. Master and student worked side by side through long afternoons while sunlight slowly crossed the floor. Sometimes they spoke for hours about materials and methods. Sometimes they worked in complete silence, interrupted only by the steady rhythm of tools meeting wood and stone. For Daedalus, these became unexpectedly joyful days. Teaching forced him to see familiar things with fresh eyes. Questions he had long ago answered for himself became new again when spoken aloud. Why must every roof bear weight this way? Could a hinge move differently? Was every tool already perfect? Perdix asked without fear. The boy possessed an imagination that wandered freely, while remaining firmly tied to careful observation. One afternoon they walked together beyond the city, gathering branches for a new project. Along the shore they found the skeleton of a large fish, bleached pale beneath the sun. Most people would have stepped around it without another thought. Perdix stopped. He knelt quietly beside the spine. His fingers traced the sharp repeating bones. Daedalus watched without speaking. After several minutes, the boy broke a thin branch from a nearby shrub and began drawing shapes in the sand. The bones are all alike, Perdix said softly. Each one cuts because of the point. Daedalus looked from the drawing to the fish's spine. The thoughts settled slowly between them. Back at the workshop, Perdix shaped a blade with small teeth like those he had seen upon the skeleton. The first saw was born not from force, but from careful attention. Daedalus turned the tool over in his hands for a long time. Its usefulness was immediately obvious. Wood that once demanded slow cutting could now be divided with greater ease and surprising precision. He praised the boy sincerely. The invention was beautiful, not because it was complicated, because it was simple enough to seem as though it had always existed, waiting for someone observant enough to notice. Weeks later, another idea appeared. Perdix joined two slender pieces of metal with a single pin, so they opened and closed together. One point remained fixed, while the other traveled in a perfect circle. With this simple instrument, circles could be drawn with remarkable accuracy. Again, the solution seemed obvious only after it existed. Daedalus admired the tool, yet something small shifted inside him. At first the feeling was so faint he barely recognized it. Pride remained, affection remained, but another feeling rested quietly beneath them. He found himself studying Perdix more closely. The boy no longer waited for instruction before attempting new ideas. He saw possibilities immediately. Sometimes, while Daedalus carefully refined an existing design, Perdix would quietly arrive beside him, holding something entirely unexpected. Each invention carried the same unmistakable quality, not imitation, original thought. Visitors began noticing. Your apprentice has clever hands. The boy learns quickly. He may become as skilled as his uncle. The words were spoken kindly, yet they lingered. Daedalus had spent his entire life believing that craft was a gift meant to be shared. Had he not devoted himself to teaching? Had he not welcomed the boy into the workshop with genuine warmth? So why did those harmless compliments remain with him after everyone had gone? One evening, after Perdix had returned home, Daedalus walked alone through the quiet workshop. He paused before the shelves where the boy's newest tools rested beside his own. The saw, the compass, two elegant ideas born from young hands. He reached out and lifted the saw carefully. Its balance was excellent. Its teeth caught the light with quiet confidence. For the first time in many years, Daedalus experienced something unfamiliar. Not doubt in his skill, doubt in his place. He had always believed that mastery was a destination reached through patience and labor. Now he wondered whether mastery was only a resting place before someone younger continued the journey. The thought unsettled him more than he wished to admit. Outside, Athens settled into evening. Inside the workshop, surrounded by every invention that had earned his name respect throughout the city, Daedalus stood holding the boy's remarkable creation, listening to a silence that no longer felt entirely peaceful, as an emotion he had never before allowed into his heart quietly began to take shape. An emotion he had never before allowed into his heart quietly began to take shape. And once it had found a place within him, the peace of the workshop was never quite the same again. At first, Daedalus tried to ignore it. He devoted himself to work with even greater care, arriving before sunrise and remaining long after the lamps had become the only light within the room. His hands continued to move with their familiar precision, yet his thoughts no longer rested entirely upon the material before him. Whenever Perdix discovered another elegant solution, Daedalus felt two truths at once. The first was admiration, the second was fear. He admired the boy because he recognized genuine brilliance. Perdix did not merely repeat what he had been taught. He looked at the world as though every ordinary object still contained an unanswered question. Watching him was like watching a younger version of himself, except that the gift seemed to grow even more naturally. That was the source of the fear. It was not that Daedalus believed he would suddenly lose his skill. His hands still possessed everything they had always known. His eye remained as careful as ever. But he had begun to wonder whether the world remembered only the greatest maker. If another surpassed him, would everything he had built slowly fade into memory? It was a thought that embarrassed him. He had spent years believing that true craftsmanship was not a contest. A beautiful thing remained beautiful regardless of who created it. Yet somewhere beneath those honest beliefs lived another voice, quieter but persistent. It whispered that the master was no longer the only master. The change was so gradual that even Perdix never noticed it. The boy continued asking questions with the same cheerful curiosity. He still looked toward his uncle with respect. When he completed a new design, the first person he wished to show was always Daedalus. Nothing had changed in the boy's heart. Everything had changed in the man's. There were days when Daedalus caught himself studying Perdix instead of the work. The young hands moved with growing confidence. Mistakes became less frequent. Ideas arrived more quickly. Visitors to the workshop increasingly paused beside the apprentice's bench before walking toward the masters. Their admiration remained respectful, but Daedalus heard every word. The boy has remarkable promise. He sees things differently. Imagine what he will become. Each sentence lingered after the speaker had left. One afternoon, uncle and nephew climbed the slopes of the Acropolis to measure repairs needed for an aging structure. From that height, Athens spread below them in warm afternoon light. The temples gleamed softly. Smoke rose from household fires. The sea shimmered in the distance. Perdix spoke excitedly about improvements that could make buildings stronger while using less stone. Daedalus listened. Every suggestion was thoughtful. Every observation was correct. He should have felt pride. Instead, he felt something tightening quietly within him. The feeling frightened him because it did not resemble the careful craftsman he believed himself to be. It resembled hunger, not hunger for food, hunger to remain unmatched. He tried to silence it. He reminded himself that every teacher hoped the student would one day exceed the master. He repeated those words inwardly, as though they alone could make them true. But fear has its own language. It speaks softly. It asks questions that seem almost reasonable. What if there is no place for you afterward? What if everything you have built becomes only the beginning of someone else's greatness? By the time those questions have been recognized, they have often already settled deep within the heart. The wind moved gently across the high stone. Perdix stepped closer to the edge, looking down over the city, whose streets he hoped one day to help shape with his own hands. He spoke of new ideas, new tools, new ways of building. Daedalus heard the words, but another sound filled his thoughts, the quiet voice of fear. It lasted only a moment, a single moment. Later generations would remember the act itself. Few would remember how brief it was. The hands that had shaped beautiful things reached forward. They pushed. Perdix disappeared from the edge. Silence followed, not the peaceful silence of the workshop, a terrible silence, the kind that arrives when a single heartbeat divides one life from another. Daedalus stood frozen. The world seemed unable to move. The city below continued exactly as before. Birds crossed the sky. The breeze touched the stone. Sunlight warmed the ancient walls. Only one thing had changed. The craftsman whose hands had always existed to create had used those same hands to destroy. But the fall did not end as every mortal fall must. Athena, whose wisdom watched over both craft and those who practiced it honestly, saw the innocent boy as he fell. Before the earth could claim him, she transformed him into a small bird. His arms became wings. His body grew light. The child who had loved observing the world from careful heights became the partridge, a bird that forever afterward would remain close to the ground, never trusting great heights again. It was mercy, but it was also remembrance. Every fluttering partridge would carry within it the memory of a gifted student whose future had been stolen by the fear of the man who should have protected him. The truth could not remain hidden. Athens learned what had happened. The city that had celebrated Daedalus for his genius now gathered to judge him not by the beauty of his creations, but by the darkness of his choice. His skill could not erase his crime. His inventions could not outweigh a life. The sentence was exile. He was to leave the city that had shaped him, Leave the workshop where every tool rested exactly where his hands expected to find it. Leave the streets where his reputation had first been built. When Daedalus entered the workshop one final time, he did not look first at his own creations. His eyes settled upon the empty bench where Perdix had once stood, and in the stillness of that room, surrounded by tools that could build almost anything except the life he had taken, he slowly understood that some things, once broken, could never be made whole again. As he reached for the few possessions he would carry into a future far from Athens, he slowly understood that some things, once broken, could never be made whole again. As he reached for the few possessions he would carry into a future far from Athens, when Daedalus left the city, he did not look back often, not because he wished to forget it, because every glance reminded him of the life he had lost with his own hands. The road away from Athens was long, winding through hills scented with pine and wild thyme before descending toward the sea. He traveled quietly, carrying only a small collection of tools, a few carefully wrapped drawings, and the knowledge that the workshop where he had spent so much of his life would continue without him. The weight upon his shoulders was not heavy. The weight within him was. Every village he passed seemed filled with ordinary lives. Children laughed beside wells. Carpenters repaired wagons. Potters turned wet clay into bowls beneath the afternoon sun. The simple rhythm of work continued everywhere. Daedalus watched these moments with unexpected tenderness. He had once believed that skill alone gave meaning to a life. Now he wondered whether kindness mattered far more. The sea eventually opened before him, blue and endless beneath the warm light of the Aegean sky. Ships crossed its surface with white sails lifted by patient winds. For most travelers, the sea promised opportunity. For Daedalus, it promised distance. Distance from the city that had shaped him. Distance from the workshop where every tool still remembered the touch of his hands. Distance from the empty place where Perdix should have stood. He boarded a merchant vessel bound for Crete. The sailors welcomed him without recognizing the famous craftsman whose name had once been celebrated throughout Athens. To them, he was simply another traveler. Daedalus was grateful for that. Fame had become strangely heavy. Each evening he sat quietly near the stern of the ship, listening to the steady rhythm of water against the hull. The sea possessed its own kind of workshop. The ropes stretched and relaxed with the wind. The wooden mast answered every change in the weather. The sails breathed like living things. Watching them, Daedalus found himself studying every knot and every joint, admiring the anonymous craftsmen who had shaped the vessel. Their work carried lives safely across uncertain waters, and yet no songs would ever remember their names. There was a quiet dignity in that. As the days passed, the island of Crete slowly rose from the horizon. It seemed different from Attica even before they reached its shores. Its mountains climbed sharply toward the sky. Olive groves covered gentle hillsides. The air carried the scent of salt, warm stone, and flowering herbs that grew between rocky paths. Everything felt brighter. The light lingered longer upon the sea. The shadows beneath the trees seemed softer. Crete was a kingdom shaped not only by its land, but by the water surrounding it. Ships arrived from distant places carrying copper, ivory, cedar, fine cloth, and stories gathered from every corner of the known world. At its center ruled King Minos. His power rested not merely upon soldiers or wealth, but upon order. His harbors were busy, his storehouses full, his laws respected. He understood that a kingdom became strong not only through victory in battle, but through careful building, steady trade, and skilled hands. When word reached him that Daedalus, the greatest craftsman of Athens, had arrived upon the island, he did not hesitate. The king invited the exile into his court. Minos studied the man carefully. He saw neither the celebrated genius nor the condemned murderer alone. He saw a craftsman, a man capable of making things that others could scarcely imagine. For a king responsible for an ambitious kingdom, such talent was too valuable to ignore. Daedalus accepted the king's protection. It was not a joyful beginning. It was simply the beginning available to him. Soon a new workshop was prepared. It stood near the royal palace, but slightly apart from its noise, where fresh air entered through wide windows and morning sunlight crossed long workbenches before reaching the stone floor. When Daedalus stepped inside for the first time, he remained still for several moments. The room was empty. No tools hung upon the walls. No timber rested upon the benches. No scent of cedar or bronze yet filled the air. It was only space. Yet he knew how to begin. The first object he placed inside was not a magnificent invention. It was a simple workbench, strong, level, without ornament. Every workshop began there. Only after the bench stood firmly in place did he arrange his tools. Each chisel found its proper position. Each hammer rested where the hand would naturally reach. Files, awls, planes, measuring cords, bronze blades, whetstones, all returned to the quiet order that had always calmed his thoughts. As the workshop slowly filled, something unexpected happened. His breathing became easier, not because grief had lessened. It had not. But because work remained possible. The hands still remembered what to do. King Minos soon began bringing commissions. Some were practical: a stronger gate for a harbor warehouse, new pulleys for lifting heavy stone, water channels that carried fresh spring water more efficiently through gardens and courtyards. Others required greater imagination, furniture whose hidden joints appeared seamless, mechanical devices that opened great doors with surprising ease, decorations that seemed almost alive in their careful movement. Each commission challenged Daedalus differently. Each reminded him that creation still lived within him. The court watched his work with quiet astonishment. Artisans gathered simply to observe. Young apprentices whispered among themselves as impossible ideas slowly became ordinary beneath his hands. Yet Daedalus himself accepted little praise. Each completed work brought satisfaction that lasted only briefly before another thought appeared. Could it have been stronger, lighter, simpler, more elegant? Perfection remained forever one careful improvement beyond reach. Sometimes, late in the evening, after everyone else had gone, he would sit alone inside the workshop. The lamps cast warm circles of light across polished wood and neatly arranged tools. Outside, the sounds of Crete drifted gently through the open windows. The distant surf, evening birds, voices carried faintly across the palace grounds. The island had begun offering him something Athens no longer could. Not forgiveness, that would never be given so easily, but shelter. A place where his hands could continue speaking the language they had always known. Still, there were moments when his gaze settled upon the empty space beside his workbench, and for the briefest instant he imagined another pair of young hands reaching eagerly toward a new invention, before the memory quietly faded, leaving only the steady sound of his own tools as a royal messenger approached with a request unlike any he had ever received before. A royal messenger approached with a request unlike any he had ever received before. And as the footsteps echoed through the quiet workshop, Daedalus set down his tools with the strange feeling that another turning in his life had arrived. The messenger bowed respectfully and spoke only a few words. Queen Pasiphae wished to see him. Daedalus had worked for King Minos long enough to understand that requests from the royal household were rarely simple. Kings asked for walls, ships, gates, and machines. Their needs could usually be measured in timber, stone, or bronze, but queens often carried questions that could not be solved so easily. He followed the messenger through the palace, The halls of Minos were unlike those of Athens. Wide courtyards opened toward the sea, allowing warm breezes to drift through polished columns. Walls were covered with painted scenes of dolphins, lilies, and leaping bulls. Everywhere there was movement and color, reminding visitors that Crete was a kingdom closely tied to both the sea and the living world. Yet beneath that beauty, Daedalus sensed a quiet unease. Servants spoke softly, eyes lowered quickly. Something invisible had settled over the palace. When he entered the queen's chamber, Pasiphae stood beside an open window overlooking the distant fields. She did not turn immediately. For several moments both remained silent. At last she faced him. Daedalus saw not simply a queen, but a woman carrying an impossible burden. There was dignity in her posture, but also exhaustion. She seemed like someone who had spent many nights searching for peace without finding it. When she spoke, her voice was calm. She explained that the gods had placed upon her a terrible affliction. Her heart had become consumed by an unnatural longing for a magnificent white bull that had been sent from the sea by Poseidon himself. The animal was unlike any other. Its coat shone almost silver beneath the sun. Its strength inspired awe rather than fear. It was meant to have been offered as a sacred sacrifice, but King Minos, admiring its beauty, had kept it alive. The god had answered that act of pride with a punishment no mortal could have imagined. Daedalus listened without interruption. He understood enough of the gods to know that divine anger often reached innocent people as easily as guilty ones. Pasiphae did not ask him to explain the curse. She asked something far more difficult. She asked him to help her, not with medicine, not with prayer, with craft. The request seemed impossible. She needed a wooden figure shaped so perfectly like a living cow that the sacred bull would accept it as real. Silence filled the room. Daedalus felt the familiar stirring that always came before a difficult design. Normally, it brought curiosity. This time it brought hesitation. His mind immediately began imagining solutions. The frame could be made from carefully bent ash wood. The outer surface might be covered with real hide. Hidden wheels could allow gentle movement across the pasture. Every problem suggested another answer. That was how his mind had always worked. Yet another part of him asked a different question. Should every problem be solved simply because it can be? The memory of Athens returned quietly. The empty bench, Perdix, the realization that skill carried responsibility. Daedalus remained silent for a long while. Pasiphae watched him patiently. She did not command. She pleaded. Whatever dignity remained to her had already been worn thin by the burden she carried. At last, Daedalus lowered his eyes. He believed he was helping someone trapped by suffering. He believed compassion required action, perhaps somewhere even deeper. He believed that making beautiful things could still redeem the hands that had once committed such darkness. So he accepted. The work began in complete secrecy. Only a handful of trusted servants knew what was happening. The workshop was closed to visitors. Heavy curtains covered the windows. The strange commission unfolded quietly beneath the sound of careful tools. Daedalus approached the task as he approached every creation. He studied living cattle for days. He observed the curve of the spine, the gentle movement of breathing, the way sunlight rested upon smooth hide. Nothing escaped his attention. He carved a strong wooden frame that balanced perfectly upon hidden wheels. Flexible joints allowed natural movement. Layers of carefully treated cowhide covered every surface until wood disappeared completely beneath living texture. Even the scent mattered. Fresh grasses and oils were rubbed into the hide so that nothing artificial remained. Every detail reflected astonishing craftsmanship, and with every improvement, Daedalus felt the same uneasy thought returning. The object itself was remarkable. Its purpose was not. Many nights he remained alone after the lamps had burned low. He would walk slowly around the unfinished figure, running his fingers across the carefully stretched hide. It was impossible not to admire the precision of the work. It was equally impossible to ignore what that work would allow. Creation had once seemed simple. A better tool eased labor. A stronger bridge protected travelers. A smoother wheel carried heavier loads. Now creation existed in a place where skill and morality no longer walked together so easily. His hands knew how to build. His heart no longer knew where building should end. When the wooden cow was finally complete, it appeared astonishingly lifelike. Anyone seeing it from even a short distance might have believed it breathed. Daedalus stepped back quietly. The workshop was still. The invention stood before him, flawless in execution. He should have felt pride. Instead, he felt only weariness. The queen thanked him with genuine gratitude. There were tears in her eyes, not of joy, but of relief that the impossible had become possible. Daedalus accepted her thanks with quiet humility. He never asked what followed. He did not need to. Some creations leave the maker's hands and become part of another person's story, but they never entirely leave the maker's conscience. Time moved gently onward. Then whispers began moving through the palace. Soft conversations stopped when others approached. Servants exchanged uncertain glances. The queen withdrew from public life. Months later, news spread that a child had been born. Yet it was not a child alone. It possessed the body of a boy and the head of a bull. The palace fell into horrified silence. Some blamed the gods. Some blamed the curse. Some whispered of hidden sins. Daedalus said nothing. He looked at his own hands for a very long time. They had not created the curse. They had not chosen the pride that angered Poseidon. Yet without his skill, this child would never have entered the world. For the second time in his life, he discovered that an invention could continue changing lives long after the craftsman had finished his work. And as King Minos summoned him once more, his voice heavy with a problem that no kingdom had ever faced before, Daedalus quietly understood that the greatest work of his life was only just beginning. Daedalus quietly understood that the greatest work of his life was only just beginning, though it would become the creation he wished had never been imagined. King Minos received him in a chamber far quieter than usual. The confidence that had once marked the king's voice had been replaced by the careful tone of a ruler searching for a solution where none seemed to exist. The child born to Queen Pasiphae could not live among ordinary people. The boy had the body of a human, but the head and nature of a bull. As he grew, so did his strength. The palace became filled with fear. Servants avoided certain corridors. Guards stood watch where children had once played. Yet beneath all the whispers and frightened glances was another truth. The child had never chosen to be born. Daedalus thought about that often. The creature who would later be called the Minotaur had entered the world carrying the weight of decisions made by others. The pride of Minos, the punishment of Poseidon, the suffering of Pasiphae, and the skill of the craftsman who had built the wooden cow. The child belonged to none of these choices, yet he would bear all of their consequences. Minos asked only one thing: build a place from which there could be no escape, not a prison, something greater, something so confusing that anyone entering would lose all sense of direction, a place that could contain the growing creature forever, protecting both the kingdom and the child from one another. Daedalus remained silent. The request settled heavily upon him. Years before, when he was still a young craftsman in Athens, he would have felt excitement at such an impossible challenge. Now excitement came mixed with caution. He had learned that remarkable creations often carried remarkable burdens. Still, the problem stood before him. A child could not simply be abandoned. The kingdom could not live in fear. No ordinary walls would hold such extraordinary strength. If there was an answer, it would have to be unlike anything ever built. So Daedalus accepted, not because he celebrated the task, because he believed there was no gentler solution. He began not with stone, but with walking. For many days he wandered the hills beyond the palace, following winding animal paths through forests and rocky valleys. Shepherd trails crossed one another unexpectedly. Streams divided and joined again. Trees concealed familiar landmarks, until every direction seemed equally possible. Nature herself offered lessons. A forest rarely confused those who remained patient, but careful design could. Returning to his workshop, Daedalus filled table after table with drawings. Straight corridors disappeared from his plans almost immediately. The human mind expected straight lines. It trusted them. Instead, he drew gentle curves that slowly changed direction without announcing themselves. He placed identical intersections where each choice appeared equally correct. Passages folded back upon themselves so subtly that a traveler might unknowingly return near the place they had begun, while believing they had gone forward. Nothing relied upon tricks. Everything relied upon expectation. He understood something fundamental about people. Most did not become lost because the path was difficult. They became lost because they believed they already understood it. Weeks became months. His workshop transformed into a world of models. Small walls of carved wood covered every surface. Tiny staircases climbed toward nowhere. Miniature courtyards opened into fresh passages before quietly disappearing again. Sometimes Daedalus spent entire afternoons simply walking his fingers through these little wooden labyrinths, searching for weaknesses invisible at first glance. If his fingers could escape too easily, so could a person. The design continued changing. It became less like a building, more like an idea given physical form. At last construction began. Thousands of workers carried stone beneath the bright Cretan sun. Great blocks were lifted into place using ingenious machines designed by Daedalus himself. Passage connected to passage. Walls rose slowly from the earth. Hidden chambers appeared behind ordinary corridors. Staircases descended into unexpected halls before climbing once more. No single worker understood the entire design. Only Daedalus carried the complete pattern within his mind. Each morning he walked through the unfinished structure before anyone else arrived. The silence inside was unlike any silence he had known. The walls seemed to absorb sound. Even footsteps became uncertain. As the corridors multiplied, strange moments began occurring. Workers who had spent weeks building one section occasionally found themselves unable to leave without guidance. Experienced stonemasons laughed at first, then stopped laughing. The place truly confused them. Daedalus had succeeded. The realization brought little satisfaction. When the final stone was placed, the labyrinth stretched beneath Crete like a sleeping puzzle. It possessed no beauty meant for admiration. Its beauty existed only in its perfect design. Every turn served a purpose. Every passage answered another. Every dead end quietly encouraged the traveler toward deeper uncertainty. It was the most extraordinary work Daedalus had ever completed. It was also the loneliest. King Minos walked beside him through the finished corridors. The king marveled at the ingenuity. He praised the craftsmanship. He declared that no prison had ever equaled it. Daedalus accepted the praise politely. Yet while the king admired walls and passages, Daedalus found himself thinking only of the life that would soon inhabit them. The Minotaur was brought there quietly. No celebration marked the moment, no triumph, only necessity. The creature, still young but already powerful, disappeared into the endless passages. The great doors closed behind him. For a long time afterward, Daedalus stood outside without speaking. He wondered whether the child understood why he had been left alone. He wondered whether loneliness felt different inside endless stone than beneath an open sky. He wondered whether a prison built from genius remained a prison all the same. Years passed. The Labyrinth became part of Crete. Visitors spoke of it in hushed voices. Stories grew larger with every telling. Some claimed monsters waited behind every corner. Others believed spirits wandered its endless halls. Very few understood that its greatest mystery was not the creature living within it. Its greatest mystery was the man who had imagined it. Daedalus often returned alone to inspect the great structure. He knew every hidden chamber, every staircase, every turning passage. He alone could walk its winding paths without becoming lost. Yet sometimes, deep within the silent corridors, he paused and listened. Far away, carried faintly through layers of stone, came the lonely sound of a creature born through no fault of his own. And each time Daedalus heard it, he wondered whether he had built a masterpiece, or simply given sorrow a home that no one else could ever escape. Just as a young Athenian prince named Theseus began sailing across the sea toward Crete. Just as a young Athenian prince named Theseus began sailing across the sea toward Crete, Daedalus found himself once again standing at the edge of a choice whose consequences he could not fully see. The years had softened nothing. His hands were as steady as ever. His workshop remained filled with ingenious devices, elegant carvings, clever mechanisms, and tools that made impossible tasks seem almost ordinary. Kings continued to admire his work. Visitors still stood in quiet amazement as he transformed simple materials into objects of remarkable beauty and usefulness. Yet beneath every creation rested the same question: what happens after the maker lets go? The labyrinth had become part of Crete's identity. People spoke of it with a mixture of fear and fascination, but very few had ever seen its endless passages. Most knew only the stories. A prison unlike any ever built, a place where direction itself seemed to vanish. Deep within those stone corridors lived the Minotaur. Sometimes, late in the evening when the palace had grown quiet, Daedalus would walk alone to the entrance. He never entered very far. He simply stood where the first passages disappeared into shadow. The cool air drifting outward carried no answers, only silence. He often wondered whether the creature remembered sunlight, whether he still dreamed of open fields he had never truly known, whether anyone could remain human after years of endless loneliness. Daedalus never blamed the child. If blame belonged anywhere, it rested among the choices of kings, the anger of gods, and perhaps his own willingness to build whatever his hands were capable of creating. Then one morning the rhythm of the island changed. Ships appeared upon the horizon, not merchant vessels, not ambassadors. A tribute had arrived from Athens. Long ago, after the death of Minos' son, the defeated Athenians had been forced into a cruel agreement. Every several years they would send young men and women across the sea to Crete, where they would be placed within the labyrinth, never to return. The people of Crete had grown accustomed to the ritual. Daedalus never had. Each arrival reminded him that the building he had designed had become more than a prison. It had become an instrument of grief. This time, however, something was different. Among the young Athenians stood a prince, Theseus. He carried himself with quiet confidence rather than pride. His strength was evident, yet it did not demand attention. When he looked upon the palace and the towering walls surrounding it, His eyes held curiosity more than fear. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered that the prince intended to kill the Minotaur. Others dismissed the idea as youthful courage that would soon disappear within the endless corridors. Daedalus listened without speaking. He knew the labyrinth too well. Strength alone could not overcome it. Even if the creature were defeated, the passages themselves remained. One could survive the monster and still never find the way back. As preparations continued, another story quietly unfolded within the palace. Princess Ariadne had seen Theseus. Like her father, she possessed a thoughtful mind. Unlike many who lived comfortably within the palace, she had never accepted the suffering surrounding the labyrinth without question. She knew the tribute was cruel. She knew innocent lives disappeared beneath the earth because of decisions made by rulers long before. When she spoke with Theseus, she saw not merely a prince. She saw another human being preparing to walk willingly toward almost certain death. Compassion stirred within her. It reminded Daedalus of something he had nearly forgotten. Not every difficult problem required another invention. Sometimes it required kindness. One afternoon, Ariadne came quietly to the workshop. She watched Daedalus for several moments before speaking. The old craftsman recognized the look in her eyes. It was the look of someone carrying a burden too heavy to bear alone. She did not ask him to build another impossible machine. Instead, she asked a question. If someone entered the labyrinth, could they ever return? Daedalus stopped working. The answer came immediately. Only if they remember every turn. Ariadne lowered her eyes. No one could do that. He remained silent. She was right. The labyrinth had been designed precisely so that memory would fail. Then Daedalus looked across his workshop. His gaze settled upon something so ordinary that it had almost become invisible. A spool of fine thread, simple, unremarkable, patiently waiting where it had always rested. An idea arrived so quietly that it seemed less like invention and more like recognition. Not every puzzle must be solved by changing the puzzle. Sometimes the answer was to leave a path behind. He lifted the spool gently. The thread caught the afternoon light. If one end remained at the entrance, he said softly, the other could always lead home. Ariadne looked at the thread for a long moment. Its simplicity almost hid its brilliance. No complicated mechanism, no secret device, only a single unbroken line. The kind of solution Daedalus admired most. Elegant because it asked so little. Powerful because it changed everything. He placed the thread into Ariadne's hands. Neither spoke for several moments. He understood what he was doing. The gift might allow Theseus to survive. It might also bring an end to the Minotaur. The child whose prison Daedalus had built would finally meet his fate. His heart became divided once again. He felt compassion for Ariadne, hope for Theseus, sorrow for the lonely creature beneath the earth. Could one act of mercy become another act of loss? He no longer knew. That night, Theseus entered the labyrinth. Ariadne remained above, holding quiet hope within her heart. Daedalus stayed alone in his workshop. He did not sleep. The familiar sounds of his tools brought no comfort. Instead, he imagined a single thread, slowly unwinding through endless corridors of stone. He imagined a young prince walking deeper into darkness. He imagined the Minotaur hearing unfamiliar footsteps after years of solitude. Hours passed like drifting shadows. Then, just before dawn, voices echoed through the palace. Theseus had returned. The thread had guided him safely back. The Minotaur was dead. Crete awoke to astonishment. Some celebrated, some mourned. King Minos did neither. His face grew still as stone. He understood immediately that only one person besides himself had possessed enough knowledge of the labyrinth to make such an escape possible. And as heavy footsteps began moving toward the workshop, Daedalus quietly realized that once again his greatest invention had not been the thing he built, but the simple act of placing hope into another person's hands. The simple act of placing hope into another person's hands had changed everything. And as the heavy footsteps moved toward the workshop, Daedalus knew that no invention could shield him from what would come next. King Minos entered without anger in his voice. His silence was far more unsettling. The workshop, once a place where ideas had been welcomed, now felt strangely small. The familiar scent of cedar and bronze lingered in the air, but it no longer brought Daedalus peace. The king looked slowly around the room. His eyes rested upon the workbench where countless creations had first taken shape. Then they settled upon the craftsman. You showed them the way. It was not a question. Daedalus did not deny it. He had spent enough years carrying the weight of hidden truths. I showed them how not to remain lost. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Minos understood what had happened. The Minotaur was dead. His daughter Ariadne had fled Crete with Theseus. The labyrinth, once believed to be impossible to escape, had yielded to something as simple as a single thread. Not because the labyrinth had failed, because its creator had chosen compassion over obedience. The king's disappointment was quiet. Perhaps that made it heavier. You built the prison, Minos said at last, and you opened it. Daedalus lowered his eyes. I did. The punishment came swiftly, not death. Minos still understood the value of the greatest craftsman alive. Instead, Daedalus and his young son, Icarus, were imprisoned within the very island they had helped shape. Some stories would later say they were confined inside the labyrinth itself. Others remembered only that they were held where escape seemed impossible. To Daedalus, the exact walls mattered little. Whether built of stone or guarded by soldiers, captivity always carried the same silence. It was during those long days that he spent more time with Icarus than ever before. The boy had grown among tools and drawings. Unlike Perdix, he was not driven by endless invention. Instead, he possessed something softer, wonder. He delighted in watching his father work. He asked questions without trying to improve every answer. He admired the finished object as much as the process that created it. When Daedalus looked at his son, he often found himself wondering how many years had already slipped quietly away. The workshop had demanded so much of his life. Kings had demanded more. Had he spent enough time simply being a father? The question lingered without reply. Though imprisoned, Daedalus' mind refused to become still. His hands had always sought solutions, not because they feared difficulty, because they believed every barrier invited another way of seeing. He studied the walls, the gates, the sea surrounding Crete. Ships were watched too carefully. Roads were guarded. The island itself had become a prison. One evening, as seabirds circled high above the cliffs, Daedalus looked upward instead of outward. The birds moved effortlessly upon invisible currents. They asked nothing of the earth. They belonged to the sky. For a long while he simply watched, the slow beating of wings, the way each feather shifted almost independently while remaining part of a single whole. Every movement carried purpose. Every shape answered the wind. A familiar feeling stirred within him, not certainty, curiosity. Back inside his chamber, he began collecting what others overlooked. Feathers left behind by seabirds, small at first, then larger ones, each carefully sorted by length and shape. Servants thought little of it. Children often gathered feathers. No one imagined what an old craftsman saw within them. Days became weeks. The collection grew. Daedalus studied every feather as carefully as he had once studied wood grain and polished bronze. Nature had already solved the problem. He only needed to understand it. Using thread, linen, and warm beeswax, he began fastening the feathers together. Short ones formed the inner layers. Long feathers stretched outward. Flexible joints allowed gentle movement. Nothing was hurried. Every evening another small section took shape. Icarus watched with fascinated eyes. "What are they?" he asked one afternoon. Daedalus smiled gently. "A lesson from the birds." The boy laughed softly. "Can people learn to fly?" His father looked toward the open window where gulls drifted across the sea. "We may never become birds." He paused. "But perhaps we can borrow their wisdom." At last the wings were complete. They rested against the workshop wall like something that belonged both to earth and sky. Beautiful, strange, fragile. Daedalus lifted one pair carefully and fastened them across his own shoulders. He moved slowly, testing balance, feeling how the feathers answered even the smallest movement of air. They worked, not through magic, not through divine favor, through observation, patience, understanding. Everything he had learned throughout his life had led quietly toward this moment. He built a second pair for Icarus, slightly smaller, lighter, perfectly fitted. As he adjusted the final bindings, he looked at his son with unusual seriousness. "There is something you must remember." Icarus listened closely. "The sea is dangerous below." The boy nodded. "The sun is dangerous above." Again he nodded. "We survive by choosing the middle path." Daedalus spoke these words about flying, yet somewhere inside he knew they belonged to life itself. Too much pride had driven King Minos to anger the gods. Too much fear had led Daedalus to destroy Perdix. Again and again he had watched people suffer because they believed they must always reach higher or hold tighter. Balance. Perhaps that had always been the lesson. Not perfection, not greatness. Balance. Before dawn they climbed quietly toward the highest cliffs overlooking the sea. The island still slept beneath the fading stars. The waves whispered softly against the rocks far below. The wind was gentle, patient, almost welcoming. Daedalus fastened the wings across Icarus one final time, checking every knot with careful hands. Then he looked once more into his son's bright, hopeful eyes. For a brief moment the old craftsman forgot kings, prisons, exile, and regret. He saw only the child he loved. Together they stepped toward the open sky. The wings caught the morning air. The earth slowly fell away beneath them. Crete became smaller. The sea stretched endlessly in every direction. For the first time in countless years, Daedalus felt something he had almost forgotten, freedom, and beside him, laughing with pure delight as the sunlight spread across the endless water, Icarus climbed a little higher, his joy carrying him upward with every beat of his remarkable wings. The wings were somewhere in the workshop, laid aside in the quality of the kept thing that was too significant to use and too significant to lose. And the Sicilian evening was coming in through the workshop entrance in the quality of the light that the island made in the late afternoon. And Daedalus sat in the quality of the old man in the place that had been his place for all the long years of the Sicilian aftermath. And the tools were around him in the quality of the familiar and the known. He had been making things for a very long time. This was the thought that came to him in the quality of the evenings, not with the drama of the retrospective, not with the quality of the man who was reviewing his existence in the performed manner of the one who was making an account of it for an audience, in the simple and the private quality of the old craftsman at the end of the working day. The thought arriving in the way that the most familiar thoughts arrived, in the quality of the long-inhabited life, not as a new arrival, but as the return of the thing that had always been present and was most present in the quality of the still. He had made the saw. He had made it in Athens before any of the rest, before Perdix and the Exile and Crete and the Labyrinth and the Wings and Icarus and Sicily. The saw that he had made from the observation of the fish's spine, the first of the great inventions, the tool that had changed the quality of the working with wood in a way that had moved through the mortal world's relationship with the material across all the ages since the making. He had made it in the workshop in Athens, when the workshop in Athens had been the whole of his world, when the world had been the tools and the materials and the quality of the making, and the city that received the making with the quality of the genuine. He thought about the workshop in Athens with the quality of the old man thinking about the first place, not with grief exactly. The grief for Athens had run its course across the long years of the Cretan and the Sicilian existence, had been present in the early years of the exile and the quality of the acute, and had settled across the years into the quality of the permanent background, the way the grief of the significant loss settled in the long aftermath into the texture of the existence rather than the foreground of it. He thought about it with the quality of the honest and the clear, the workshop in Athens as it had been, the quality of the light and the material, and the particular quality of the city around the workshop, the city that had been his and that he had lost through the act that he could not undo and had never fully understood. He understood it now. He understood it in the way that the old understood the acts of the young, not with the excuse, not with the softening that would have been dishonest, but with the full quality of the understanding that the long life produced in those who lived it with the honest attention. He had been afraid. He had been the most skilled maker the mortal world had yet produced, and he had been afraid of the boy who was his student, and who had the gift that was his gift in the younger and the more natural form, and he had done what the fear produced in the beings who could not hold it, who acted on it in the moment of its fullest force without the quality of the considered that the moment required. He had thrown a child from the Acropolis. He held this with the honest quality he had developed across the long years of the holding of difficult things. The honesty of the old craftsman who had had the full span of the mortal existence to attend to the things he had done, and who attended to them in the quality of the clear and the unsparing. He had done it. Athena had saved the boy in the form of the partridge, and the partridge flew low, because the boy remembered the fall, and the memory of the fall was in the bird's nature now. And this was the quality of the consequence that stayed with the act across all the ages, the partridge that flew low above the ground as the permanent expression of what Daedalus had done to the boy who had the gift. He looked at his hands. They were the hands of the old man, the skin thinner than it had been, the quality of the use visible in them, in the particular way of the craftsman's hands that had worked every day of a long life, the marks of the material and the tool present in the texture of the hands in the way of the record of the making. He had always attended to his hands, had always understood that the hands were the most important of all the instruments, that the skill lived in the hands in a way that it did not live in the mind, that the relationship between the hand and the material was the relationship that produced the making, and that everything else was secondary to it. The hands had made the labyrinth. He thought about the labyrinth in the quality of the old craftsman, thinking about the most morally complex of all his works, the structure that had been the most technically ambitious of all the structures he had built, and the most deliberately wrong of all the things he had made. He had built it to confuse, had built the confusion into the structure with the same quality of the complete skill that he brought to the building of the things that were designed to clarify, had organized the space of the labyrinth around the principle of the lost, the way he organized every other space around the principle of the found. He had done it for Minos. He had done many things for Minos. Minos was dead. He had received the news of Minos's death in the quality of the old man receiving the news of the ending of the thing that had defined a large part of his existence. The king who had been his patron and his jailer and his pursuer, who had given him the conditions for the greatest works of his Cretan years, and who had imprisoned him, and who had pursued him across the world with the spiral shell and the promise of the reward. Minos had come to Sicily with his soldiers and his shell and his certainty that the shell would find Daedalus, and Daedalus had threaded the shell, because the shell was the kind of problem that he could not leave unthreaded, the kind of problem that his nature required him to solve regardless of the consequence of the solving. And the daughters of Cocalus had killed Minos in the bath. He did not feel triumph. He had expected in the days when he had thought about what the death of Minos would feel like, that it would feel like something more than it felt like, some quality of the release, some lifting of the weight of the pursuit that had followed him from Crete. What it felt like was simply the ending. The king who had been the most significant figure of the Cretan years was no longer in the world, and the world was the same world in the quality of the daily as it had been before the ending, and the tools were in their places and the materials were waiting, and the evening was coming in through the workshop entrance. He had kept making. This was the thing that he understood most clearly in the quality of the old man's understanding, that the making had been the most continuous thing in his existence, the thread that ran through all of it, the constant in the quality of the everything else changing. Athens and Crete and the exile and the imprisonment and the wings and the fall and Sicily. Through all of it the making, not always the great making, not always the labyrinth or the wings, the ordinary making, the daily work of the craftsman's life. The tools attended to, and the materials worked, and the things that needed to be made being made in the quality of the faithful and the continuous. He thought about Icarus in the way he thought about Icarus in the evenings, not with the acute grief of the early years, the grief that had been present in the quality of the overwhelming in the period immediately after the fall, the grief that had made the work impossible for a time, and that had then made the work necessary, in the way that the most overwhelming grief sometimes made the most ordinary act of the daily life the only available refuge. That grief had settled across the years into what it was now, the permanent presence, the quality of the absence that was most present in the quality of the daily, the boy present in the workshop in the way of the things that were most significantly absent. Icarus had been in the workshop. He had grown up in the workshop in the years of the Cretan imprisonment. The boy who had been born on Crete, who had known no other home than the workshop and the tower, who had learned the quality of the work by being in the presence of the work across all the years of his growing. He had not been the maker that his father was. The gift had not passed in the full quality of its expression from the father to the son, and this was the ordinary truth of the gift that the tradition did not always acknowledge, that the extraordinary did not always reproduce itself in the quality of the extraordinary in the next generation, but he had been present, and the presence had been the thing, not the gift but the company, not the skill but the being there. The quality of the boy in the workshop in the afternoons of the Cretan years, the presence that the workshop had had when Icarus was in it, that was different from the quality of the workshop without him. The wings were across the workshop. He looked at them in the quality of the evening light, the feathers still holding their arrangement after all the years of the laying aside, The framework still the framework that his hands had built in the quality of the most complete making of his life. He had not used them again. He had not been able to use them, not from the fear of the flight, not from the practical consideration of the age that had made the flight unlikely, from the quality of the keeping. The wings were the last thing he had made with Icarus beside him, the last made thing that the boy's presence had been part of, and the using of them again without the boy would have been the using of the thing that was most essentially the memorial of the boy in the quality of the ordinary and the instrumental, and the wings deserved to remain in the quality of the sacred rather than the ordinary. He had made one more thing after the wings. He had made it in the first years of the Sicilian period, in the years when the grief was at its most immediate, and the making was the only available refuge from the grief. He had made a pair of small wings from the wood of the island, not the great wings, not the construction of the feathers and the wax and the framework that had been the most ambitious of all his making. The small wings, made from the wood with the quality of the hands that had always been most themselves in the work of the fine and the precise, the small wings that were the most personal thing he had ever made, the thing that was not for the using and not for the displaying, but for the keeping in the quality of the kept and the private. He kept them beside the great wings. He looked at both of them in the quality of the evening light, the great wings that had carried both of them out of the prison and into the air above the Aegean, and the small wooden wings that were the private memorial, the craftsman's own acknowledgment of the loss in the only language he had ever been fully at home in, the language of the made thing. The evening was deepening. The light that came through the workshop entrance had the quality of the late, the particular quality of the Sicilian light at the end of the day, when the sun was below the quality of the full, and the warmth of it had become the warmth of the ending rather than the warmth of the middle. He had come to love this light across the years of the Sicilian existence, had come to love the particular quality of the island at the ending of the day in the way of the old, who found in the familiar the most complete of all the available comforts. He breathed the air of the workshop, the smell of the wood and the metal and the quality of the long use, the compound smell of the workshop that had been in use across all the years of the Sicilian period, the smell that was the most immediate sensory expression of the quality of the making, the smell that was most completely his in the way that the workshop was most completely his. He breathed it, and felt the quality of the familiar in the breathing, the quality of the place that had received him after the loss, and that had held him across all the long years of the aftermath. He was tired, not the tiredness of the illness or the tiredness of the depletion, the tiredness of the old craftsman at the end of a long day of the work, the quality of the complete expenditure of the body that had given what the work required, and was now in the quality of the spent. He was tired in the way of the work's tiredness, which was the tiredness he had always known most completely, the tiredness that was also the evidence of the work having been done. He put his hands in his lap. He put them in his lap in the quality of the maker at rest, the palms upward in the position that the hands found naturally when the work was finished, the position that he had always found his hands in at the ending of the working day, the position that was the most natural expression of the hands that had been working and were now at the rest that followed the working. The workshop was quiet around him. The tools were in their places, the saw and the axe and the drill and the chisels and the planes, all of them in the quality of the organized and the attended to, the tools of the making at their rest in the quality of the day's ending. The materials were on the surfaces in the quality of the work in progress. the things that had been begun and not yet finished, the things that would be attended to when the morning came and the hands were ready again for the work. Outside the workshop, the Sicilian evening was doing what the Sicilian evening did. The light was the light of the ending day, warm and long and particular to this island. The light that fell on the sea below in the quality of the gold and the amber that the late light produced on the water. The light that had the quality of the beautiful in the way of the things that were beautiful, partly because they were passing, partly because the quality of the ending was present in the quality of the light. He could hear the sea. The sea had always been audible from the workshop in Sicily. The sound of the water on the island's shore, carrying up to the workshop in the quality of the continuous, the background sound that was the sound of the island itself, the sound that he had come to associate with the Sicilian years in the most immediate and the most sensory way. He had not always loved the sea. There had been a time when the sea had been the medium of the loss, the water below the flight, the surface that had received Icarus when the wings had come apart, the water that had shown him the feathers in the quality of the understanding that was the most terrible understanding of his life. He had come to love it. Across the years of the Sicilian existence, the sea had become the sound that was the sound of the present, the sound of the place that had received him and that had held him across the long aftermath, the sound that was the background of all the making that had happened in the Sicilian years. He heard it now in the quality of the old man who had heard it every day for all the years of the Sicilian period, and for whom the sound had become the sound of the home that Sicily had become. He was old. He was old in the way of the very old, the quality of the age that was beyond the counting of the years, the age that was felt in the body in the particular, and the complete way of the age that had accumulated all the years of all the making and all the losing and all the long aftermath of the most significant loss of the existence. He was old, and the tools were in their places, and the wings were across the workshop, and the Sicilian evening was coming through the entrance in the quality of the warm and the ending, and he was entirely, completely at rest. He closed his eyes, not the sleep exactly, the quality of the old man's rest in the evening, the quality of the between the waking and the sleeping that was the most comfortable of the positions available to the old. The quality of the rest that was neither the full presence of the waking, nor the full absence of the sleep, but the threshold between them. He thought about Icarus. He thought about him in the way of the final thinking, not the grief thinking of the early years, not the raw and the overwhelming quality of the loss in its most immediate form. The quality of the old and the completed thinking about the thing that had been the most significant of all the things. The quality of the father thinking about the son across the full distance of all the years that had passed since the morning of the flight. He had been beautiful in the air. This was the thought that arrived in the quality of the final thinking, not the fall, not the feathers on the water, not the weight of the boy's body when he had carried him to the shore of the island, the boy in the air in the quality of the flight, the young face turned upward toward the sun with the full quality of the joy of the thing that no human being had ever felt before, and that Icarus was feeling in the fullest and the most complete possible expression. He had been beautiful. He had been the most beautiful thing that Daedalus had ever seen in all the years of attending to the beautiful. And the most beautiful thing was not the labyrinth, and not the wings, and not any of the extraordinary structures and objects that the skill of his hands had produced in the full span of the making life. The most beautiful thing was his son in the air. He breathed. The air of the workshop moved through him with the quality of the breath of the old man at rest. the slow and the full breath of the body that had done its work and was now in the quality of the completed, the breathing that was the most immediate and the most honest expression of the continued existence. The sea was below. The evening was complete around him. The tools were at rest. The wings were kept. And the greatest maker the mortal world had ever produced sat in the quality of the evening in his workshop in Sicily, with his hands open in his lap, and his eyes closed, and the sound of the sea below, and the memory of his son in the air above, and rested in the full and the honest and the entirely earned quality of the rest that followed the making of everything that could be made, and the losing of everything that the making could not keep, and the long and faithful and grief-marked continuation of the work across all the years of all of it. The evening deepened. The tools were still. The wings held the last of the light, and somewhere in the quality of the deep and patient dark of the workshop's ending day, the small wooden wings that he had made in the first years of the grief sat beside the great feathered wings that had carried both of them out of the prison and into the air, the private memorial beside the great work, the father's love beside the father's skill, both of them kept in the quality of the permanent and the faithful and the entirely his. The greatest hands in the mortal world are at rest. The making is done for today. The sea is below, and the evening is above, and the workshop holds everything that the workshop has always held. The tools and the materials, and the quality of the making, and the keeping of the things that were too significant to use and too significant to lose. The long day is over.